Hello, this video is for my History 102 Fall 2025 classes. Since I'm having to have eye surgery on Tuesday, December 2nd, 2025, I wanted to do this video to review some key points in Lecture 13 and 14 that will help you on the final exam. Since we're not going to be able to have class as I'll be recovering from surgery, I wanted to go over these points with you to help you. The first item for the final exam for Fall 2025 History 102 class is you need to review, analyze, describe, discuss the Iran-Contra scandal. And so I want to kind of review and go over what I'm looking for when I do that, when you answer that question. Number one, the first thing I'm looking for on Iran-Contra is you have to show that you understand the background or the context of Iran-Contra. And here we have, the points I need you to get. Number one, Iran is a part of the Iran-Contra scandal. What do you need to understand about the context of Iran? We've gone over previously during the Carter administration, you had the hostage crisis that the Carter administration, couldn't solve. The Reagan administration, remember, after the Iran hostage crisis ends in the Carter administration, the Reagan State Department will label Iran as a terrorist state, an exporter of terror, a supporter of terrorist organizations around the world. And so what this sets up for is you really shouldn't, or you really don't have a relationship with Iran that would cause you to sell weapons to them. The second thing you need to know about Iran, or you need to mention about Iran, is what? In the 1980s, Iran and Iraq are in the middle of a war. 1980 to 88. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, and so Iran is in need of weaponry, right? Is in need of military supplies. And so that's the Iran. We need to understand terrorism in the 80s. Two main terrorist activities in the 80s were, number one, hijacking airplanes. I remember as a kid every summer planes getting hijacked. It was crazy. Every summer hijacked planes. Anyways, that's the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat. And so that's going on every summer. So you had a terrorist problem there. Directly tied to the Iran-Contra scandal is there's a group, it still exists today in Lebanon. There's a terrorist group in Lebanon. They're called Hezbollah, which is Arabic for Army of God. And what Hezbollah started doing in the late 70s, early 80s is kidnapping Westerners, mainly journalists. They kidnap the priest. They'd hold them hostage. The biggest or most, diplomatic issue, hostage taking, they actually kidnapped a CIA station chief, CIA supervisor in Lebanon. And so that, that really, creates a big issue when you have the American CIA getting their men kidnapped by Hezbollah. Hezbollah is controlled and financed by Iran. And then remember the other aspect of Iran-Contra you need to know is Nicaragua. Remember in the 70s, the pro-Western Somoza regime is kicked out of power by the Sandinistas, a left-wing communist. There's all kinds of labels for it, from just agrarian land reformers to communists. So whatever you want to label it, but left-wing, politically left government. Historians don't always agree on how quote-unquote communist they are. Anyways, and so So that's the background you need to know, the context of Iran-Contra, right? We need Iran, Hezbollah, and Nicaragua. Now remember the major players, there's the major players, just like Watergate had its major players. The major players here will be men like McFarland, Elliot Abrams. On the test, most likely you will talk about Oliver North. It's kind of the star of the show. He's a Marine, a National Security Council aide. He ends up doing a lot of the quote-unquote dirty work. He is, when you study the Iran-Contra scandal, he is meant to be the fall guy. He's all the other big players, Weinberger, Casey, Poindexter, they kind of put everything on Oliver North. And so you want to make sure you mention major players. Obviously, number one, I definitely would need to see Oliver North when you talk about him. The next thing you want to cover is, what are the goals of Iran-Contra? Like, for example, remember with Watergate, what were the goals of Watergate? Plug leaks, right? Plug leaks and find out, what political opponents are doing. What's the issue with Iran-Contra? The National Security Council wants to free the Lebanon hostages, and then help the Contras, right? And so you want to kind of mention that. What is the administration trying to accomplish with Iran-Contra? Free the hostages in Lebanon and help the Contras. So the National Security Council puts together this plot with Oliver North as the gopher, the go-to guy. He's going to do quite a bit. Remember this map, or this visual, not really a map, but a visual. In a nutshell, what is Iran-Contra? We sell missiles to Iran through Israel, right? Israel's actually giving them the missiles, and then we're restocking them. But you're selling missiles to Iran through Israel, right? What is Iran supposed to do once they get the missiles? They're supposed to go to Hezbollah and get Hezbollah to cough up the hostages. And then what is the U.S. or Oliver North? Once Oliver North gets a hold of this money, what is he supposed to do? He's supposed to help the Contras. And so that's, on the test, if you're just quickly kind of summarizing Iran-Contra, that's it. You're selling missiles to Iran through Israel. The Iranians are supposed to get Hezbollah to cough up weapons. Oliver North is supposed to take the money from the weapon sales and go help the Contras, those poor Contras. Okay. So that's kind of the nutshell. So you summarize it. You decide how much detail you want to get. If you want to talk about Ghorbanifar, interesting story there. The Nicaragua part. Oliver North has money. Okay, from this Iranian money deal, missile deal. Oliver North is helping the Contras, getting the CIA planes sent out. He's also soliciting private donations. Remember I told you the story about the Dallas lady. He gets her to cough up $600,000. Help the Contras. Okay. And so you want to go into that. So once you summarize Iran-Contra, you then want to talk about how the story breaks and what happens after that. The story breaks in two ways. A Lebanese newspaper breaks the weapons sales part, and then a CIA plane crashes and the Sandinistas catch them. And what are you doing here? Okay. One aspect of the Iran-Contra scandal I want you to deal with is what is the difference between Nixon and Reagan? Watergate brought Nixon down. The Iran-Contra, it dented Reagan's popularity some, but no, he didn't get impeached and didn't get removed from office. And so, what's the difference between Reagan and Nixon? Number one, this press conference. What did the Nixon administration do once Watergate broke? The Watergate story broke. The Nixon administration denied involvement. White House had nothing to do with that. What does Reagan do, though? He has a press conference. He admits part of it. He admits the Iran weapons part. Plausible deniability on the Contra part, because why? By this point, Oliver North's name is everywhere. And so you fire Oliver North, you fire Casper Weinberger, CIA chief Casey's allowed to retire, and so you're cleaning house. Did Nixon fire people? No. Once he found out about Watergate, specifically that, what did he do? He's like, well, how much are you bribing him? Bribing more, you're, and then obstruction of justice. You're trying to get the CIA to investigate rather than the FBI. But what happens here? Reagan has a press conference and he fires people involved. You have hearings in the summer of '87, and this is kind of the second aspect of the difference between Reagan and Nixon. Nixon had a John Dean. Nixon had John Dean who spilled everything. Reagan doesn't have a John Dean. Oliver North is almost happy to be the fall guy. The closest he would come to implicating Ronald Reagan was, everything I did was approved. Everything, but then he would never say who exactly, but everything I did was approved. Everything I did was approved. If he did mention a name, it was, one of the, L. Abrams or one of the other National Security Council people. And so that's the second thing, is Reagan didn't have a John Dean. It didn't look like he was fully a part of the Iran-Contra scandal, right? And so you want to talk about the background, you want to describe Iran-Contra, you want to discuss the ending of it, and how Nixon and Reagan were different. How the Watergate scandal was different than the Iran-Contra scandal. You want to delve into Reagan and Iran-Contra. It appears that Reagan had enough plausible deniability. He had administration goals. It appears that the National Security Council, did their activities, and President Reagan didn't ask too many questions about what was going on. And so, next, what we want to look at is Lecture 14, look at what is on the final for that. So Lecture 13, the big issue on the final is Iran-Contra. We get to the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, what we want to go over, the first thing I have you look at is major figures. So remember on the Lecture 14 end of the Cold War, what did we look at? First we reviewed the Cold War. We kind of went over a lot of stuff that we already talked about. Like, what did we go over? What did we talk about? The next item you need to look at for the final exam is major figures. We talked about 4 major figures in the end of the Cold War. And so your answer will be, you'll divide it up between Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher, and Mikhail Gorbachev. So you look at, kind of summarize each of those 4 and their part in the end of the Cold War. So number 1, Pope John Paul II. What did you have? You had the first non-Italian Pope in like 400 years. You had a Pope who was from a communist country. It was extremely anti-communist himself. And so you have this rhetorical agent who will speak out against the communism, the immorality of communism, the immorality of Marxism, the evils of totalitarian government. And so when you look at Pope John Paul II and how he was able to influence the end of the Cold War as you speak out against oppression by Marxism. And remember, I told you the story about Pope John Paul II visiting Poland. The Polish and Russian government and the Soviet government thought, oh, well, Polish people, they've had decades of communism. Surely they're good communists. They're good atheistic communists. Surely they'll not go out and see the Pope. Well, the Pope shows up, millions go see the Pope, right? The second major figure, Ronald Reagan, and it kind of talked about how, a lot of historians don't like President Reagan because he has a different political point of view than you, right? U.S. historians are generally Democrats or some other left-wing political party. They tend to be politically progressive or Marxist, so they tend not to like capitalists and Republicans and conservative people are politically conservative. And so part of the issue for you when you study Reagan is you get a very biased look at it from popular history because historians don't like Reagan politically, so they're going to downplay or dismiss his role in ending the Cold War, and that's not historically accurate. Even if you don't agree with his politics, I believe you still need to acknowledge his contribution to ending the Cold War. I'll give you an example. I don't like Gorbachev politically. I don't like him politically. I don't like Marxism. I don't like Gorbachev politically. I still acknowledge the great contribution to the end of communism in Eastern Europe and Soviet Mikhail Gorbachev. You get it? You can still objectively recognize, or you can still recognize people's objective contribution to something and still disagree with them politically. So I think that's the biggest problem with President Reagan is historians don't like him politically, so they're going to downplay him, which I think is inappropriate. Reagan brought about a confrontation with communism. His rhetoric, his policies brought about a final confrontation with the Soviet Empire. Massive defense spending causes the Soviets to engage in a military buildup they can't sustain. It exposes weaknesses in the Soviet economy. I told you the kind of funny story about Star Wars. The Reagan administration announces Star Wars, and we don't find this out until after the Cold War ends, but we look at Russian documents, but the Soviet government was terrified. They were like, what is going on? They thought Reagan was going to start World War III. Critics of Reagan thought he was going to start World War III. But he, and so the Soviet government was like, oh no, Star Wars, we got to get going. And I told you kind of the funny story. Soviet scientists are telling the government, this is full of, don't worry about it. This is Star Wars and science fiction. No one can do this. Like we're in the mid '80s. We're in the early mid '80s. The technology isn't there for lasers in space, and guys, we're in 2025, and we're just barely developing laser technology, right? Like we have lasers today. There's military weapons that use lasers to shoot. They're prototypes and stuff. You get it. We're just barely getting to that now in the 2020s. So in the 80s, Russian scientists are telling the government they can't do it. There's no way. The Reagan's full of hot air. It's just ignored. But the government chose to believe that maybe Reagan is crazy, and so, anyways, so I told you that fun story. But President Reagan brought out a rhetorical, moral confrontation with the immoral Soviet Union. Remember we talked about Margaret Thatcher? Kind of a similar thing with Reagan. U.S. historians and British historians tend to be left on the political spectrum, and so they don't like people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, so they're going to downplay their contributions because they don't like them, they don't want to, But like Reagan, Margaret Thatcher confronted the communists, not only in her own country at home, socialists and communists, but also abroad. She spoke about freedom. She spoke about liberty and the benefits of a free society. And so, and then skipping down, Mikhail Gorbachev, remember, he's definitely a major figure in ending the Cold War. There's no way you can talk about the end of the Cold War without mentioning Mikhail Gorbachev, right? He becomes the Soviet premier in the mid-'80s. He's relatively young. Gorbachev's first critique of the Soviet Empire is it's Stalin-esque, it's scaloric, it's bureaucratic, it still looks like Stalin, and Stalin's been dead for 35 years. 35, 40 years, however long it is. He died in 1955 or 1985, so 30. He's been dead for 3 decades, right? And so, what does Gorbachev want to do? He wants to reform the Soviet system. So remember, this is your first kind of lesson in that. Gorbachev was a committed Marxist to the end of to today. Like he was always a committed Marxist. He did not want to end communism in the Soviet Union. He viewed Marxism as the way to go. Okay, he was just wanting to reform the system. It was too beholden to Stalin for his point of view. And so what does he do? He introduces some terms, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika and glasnost, publicity, restructuring your publicity. Open up the system a little bit, let in some fresh air, and hopefully bad things won't happen, right? And so Gorbachev's reforms, Gorbachev's political skill are definitely going to be handed in the Cold War. But keep in mind, this is unintentional. Gorbachev doesn't intend to end Soviet communism. He wants to reform it to be healthier. Okay? And so those are the 4 major figures you need to talk about. The next thing is, remember I talked about, you need to know 2 ways communism ended in Eastern Europe. I talked about Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. You talked about 2 of the 3. What do all 3 have in common? The first thing you can do is just talk about this. What do all 3 have in common? It came down to what? What do these communist governments decide to do? Do they shoot? Do they lock down, shut down the protests? Or do they, have elections, which they're pretty sure they'll lose? And so, that's kind of the big theme of these 3, is the idea that, when you have social reform, and ultimately for governments, it gets down to what are you willing to do to maintain the social order? What are you willing to do to keep power? Remember in Poland in 1982, the Polish government decided to shoot. Okay. They drove the Solidarity movement underground. They thought they had crushed it, but it turns out they just drove it underground. What did the Polish government decide in 1989? We'll hold elections, right? So you talk about peaceful endings to into communism in Eastern Europe. That's what you want to talk about. The next question on the final is, you have to talk about 2 ways communism ends violently. And I only told you 2. So Romania and Yugoslavia. So Romania and Yugoslavia. Romania was pretty easy, right? So in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, the government decided not to start shooting. Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu decides to start shooting. You kind of have a mini civil war for a little bit, as the military and the police are split. Some military and police units decide to start shooting, and some don't, right? And so we talked about that. What ends up happening, Ceausescu's wife ended up getting shot on Christmas Day. Christmas Day for Western Europe, right? It's kind of emotionally dramatic to you and I. Oh my gosh, Christmas Day. Remember, these are Orthodox Christians, and so they don't celebrate on their Christmas Day is January, beginning of January 6th, I think. But so, it's just another day for them. And then the second way is Yugoslavia, and I went over a whole thing about Yugoslavia, right? So you want to kind of trace that, Yugoslavia, right? So what's the big thing that we need to know about Yugoslavia that we need to make sure we mention? Yugoslavia is what? is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, right? The great powers at the end of World War I took all these Slavic groups and said, "What? You're all Slavian. You're all Yugoslavians, right?" And so we had Serbs, we had Croats, we had Bosnians, and dozens of other groups. So remember, that's kind of the first thing we need to know. You have all these different national groups. Some of them want their own country, right? And so they're a little upset about being, shoved into one country, right? And so we talk about World War II, and so what's the next thing you need to make sure you mention? What did Tito do when the communists took over? What did Tito do in Yugoslavia? He shut down all the nationalism and all the religious strife, right? All the national religious divisions, he said, shut up, stop, right? He was like, stop it. And so that puts a lid, right? That puts a lid on the divisions, right? You're all good communists. You're all Yugoslavian. Okay. And so the next thing you may make sure, you need to make sure you mention Slobodan Milosevic, right? What does Slobodan Milosevic do? Tito dies, right? So the lid comes off, Tito dies. So Slobodan comes to power. So what's funny about him is he's kind of a political opportunist. When Tito was around, Slobodan Milosevic, good communist. The mask kind of comes off after Tito dies. Slobodan Milosevic is a Serbian nationalist, and so that makes other groups uncomfortable, right? And so you need to make sure you mention what happens. The different parts of Yugoslavia want to leave. Slovenia leaves. When Croatia tries to leave, a war starts, right? And then when Bosnia starts to leave, the war starts, right? You want to make sure you mention ethnic cleansing, what that is. And then you want to make sure, you want to see how the war ends, right? And so, remember, Europe's early reaction is what? Early on, Europe tries to kind of try their hand at diplomacy to get Milosevic to, hey, can we calm down here? Milosevic rejects every diplomatic overture. He wants to keep Yugoslavia together. He let Slovenia go, but Croatia, Bosnia, they can't leave. Right? And so the Europeans start to turn to the U.S. Like, you guys need to come in and do something. Under the Bush administration, it's a European issue. You don't see the Bush administration really participating. What's going on in 91, 92 for the U.S.? The Iraq War, Saddam Hussein, the 1992 elections. We're actually in a recession in 91, 92. There's actually an economic downturn in 91, 92. So it doesn't really, the U.S. isn't interested. The Clinton administration starts out the same way. The Clinton administration tends to say it's a European issue. Whatever. That'll change, and by 94, 95, that'll change, because by this point, all these stories are coming out about ethnic cleansing, mass rapes, all this horrible stuff. And so the Clinton administration finally decides to get involved, and that's where you have the Dayton Peace Accords, right? The Dayton Peace Accords, Croatia's independent, so Slovenia left. The Dayton Peace Accords, Croatia gets to leave, with borders intact. So those Serbs in Croatia, they don't get what they want, which is to be in Serbia. Borders are intact, so the Serbia part, Milosevic doesn't get what they want. Bosnia becomes a patchwork, looks like a puzzle. Go Google map of Bosnia, the Dayton Peace Accords, like a patchwork quilt of all these different ethnic groups. They have a rotating presidency. What that means is of the three major groups, so if the current president is Croat, the next president can't be Croat. And so you kind of have a rotating presidency. And then Serbia keeps Serbia, Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro. And so that's the Yugoslavian part of the Cold War ending pretty violently. Okay, the next section on the final exam, the last question is on Afghanistan. So here's the issue. One 102 class, we've gone over Afghanistan. The second one, we have not gone over Afghanistan yet. And so what I want to do here is, for one of my 102 classes, this will be reviewed to you. For the second one, I want to go over, if we were to have class next week, Tuesday, December 2nd, I would have gone over this. And so, we would have gone over the end of the Soviet Union and then Afghanistan and Ukraine. But anyway, so what I want to do here is one class will be review. For the other 102 class, I want to kind of go over this with you so you feel like you've got some explanation for it for the final. On the final of the question, I'm going to be asking you to analyze or describe, discuss, whatever, Afghanistan and U.S. history with the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, the H. Bush and Clinton administration. And so that's kind of so you want to divide it up, you can divide it up that way. So the first thing is going over the history of Afghanistan. So, long time ago, 2,000 years ago, whatever, Afghanistan is Buddhist. The region of Afghanistan is generally Buddhist, from, India, India, Pakistan part of India, China, The region's never really been a nation state. It's mainly been ruled by tribal leaders, warlords, empires who periodically go through Afghanistan, which sits on a good chunk of Afghanistan, is part of the Silk Road, the famous Silk Road trade routes, right? And so, a long time ago, it was Buddhist. Once Islam started after the 8th century, 7th century, and then onward, Islamic armies invaded the Middle East, Persia, even into India, Afghanistan. So, over time, Afghanistan becomes, a lot of them become Muslims, because Islamic armies have invaded and conquered, or colonized. Right? And so when we get to World War II, by World War II, we see attempts to create kind of a nation state of Afghanistan, taking all these tribes and putting them together in some type of a country. This is right around the same time you have India being independent, Pakistan separating from India and becoming independent, and then Afghanistan too becoming an independent, united kind of cultural group, or kind of nation state, not cultural group, but nation state. And so from the World War II era into the 70s, Afghanistan is ruled by a pro-Western civilian government. And so under Carter, by the time you get to Carter, remember, in the mid-70s, a communist revolution overthrows that pro-Western government. That pro-communist government, the communist government starts losing their war, right? So the communists take over. Well, Mujahideen, right, freedom fighters, all those tribal groups that oppose those communists, they rise up and start fighting. They're the Mujahideen, right, freedom fighters. And so this communist government, by the time you get into the Carter administration, the communist government, or left-wing government, is losing their war. So what did the Soviets do in December 1979? They invade Afghanistan, right, to support the communist government. And that story should be familiar to you. A superpower invading a country to support a team they like, the government they like. It's Vietnam. a lot of historians call Afghanistan Soviet Union's Vietnam. So under the Carter administration, you have a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to support a communist government that had taken over a few years earlier and was losing a civil war. What's the Carter administration's policy? Oh, we'll just boycott the Olympics, right? We're going to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics. So that's Carter. With Reagan, we went over Reagan, a big deal, right? What did Reagan administration do? The Reagan CIA sends weapons, weapons and money to Afghanistan, to those Mujahideen, right? To those Mujahideen, to help the Mujahideen, these freedom fighters, to help them defeat not only the communist government in Afghanistan, but the Soviet Union, who was invaded. And so you have this kind of a bigger war now, right? It becomes a proxy war. The Soviets are supporting their communist government. Americans are supporting the Mujahideen, which is Arabic for freedom fighters. And remember, so we've talked about this before, but I'll mention it again. So Mujahideen, freedom fighter, it's anyone who's fighting against the Soviets and or this communist government, right? And so the CIA isn't asking too many questions about who gets money and weapons. And so we talked about like Osama bin Laden. He has Al-Qaeda, which is Arabic for the base. He has his Al-Qaeda group in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets. I mean, that's kind of where that myth begins, that the CIA worked with Obama or helped her. I even see people say Osama bin Laden was a CIA asset, which is not true, which is not correct. But we talked about that myth last time. Is it possible that Al-Qaeda could have gotten a hold of CIA money and weapons? Sure, because the CIA wasn't asking questions. They were just giving money to anyone, right? The second group in Afghanistan that we need to know, that this would be new material, is the Taliban. Who are the Taliban? So here's the funny thing about Pakistan. Pakistan they've generally had pro-Western governments. However, Pakistani governments tend to be more supportive of religious Islamic groups than, say, like Turkey. Turkey's a secular Muslim country. They're not a religious Muslim country, right? Religiously Muslim country. It's culturally secular Muslim. And then you have countries like Iran, which has become an Islamic republic, which is Islamic religion. So Afghanistan, has generally been, that pro-Western government, they were generally secular. It was Muslim culture, but generally secular. The communist government is obviously atheistic. Pakistan's a little different. They've had pro-Western governments, but depending on the rulers, depending on the government, is how religious they've been. The Pakistani intelligence service has always been willing to help or create religiously Muslim, sometimes militant groups, and this is where the Taliban come in. The Pakistani intelligence service, the Pakistani government started funding in the 80s, schools called madrasas for young Arab, Persian, Islamic men, Muslim men, to come and study Islam. Well, not only were they studying Islam, they're also studying how to fight. And so, what the Pakistani CIA, the Pakistani intelligence organization, the Pakistani government, what they started doing in the mid to late 80s is they took the Taliban. They took these militant scholars in Islamic religion, but also knew how to fight, and they sent them to Afghanistan to fight. So all of a sudden in Afghanistan in the late 80s, and into the early 90s, you have this group of very religiously devout Muslims, burqas, men with beards, women in school, is 7th century Islam. And so, or, a kind of what they consider to be a more pure form of Islam anyways, but so this Taliban, they're now in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets. Okay. So they're a new player. Okay. So that's during the Reagan administration. Now we got to get into the Bush and Clinton administration. Okay. So 1989, we mentioned this before. Gorbachev pulls the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. Okay. So guess what? We leave. Okay. In 1989, under the Bush administration, when the Soviets left, the Bush administration pulls the CIA out. We leave. Okay. We leave. Okay. And so it creates a power vacuum. That communist government in Afghanistan is still in power. It's just they don't have help anymore. It's kind of like in Vietnam. What did we do? We pulled out of Vietnam and we told the pro-U.S. government, what? Good luck. So same thing here. The Soviets leave and they tell the communist government of Afghanistan, good luck. And so the war is going to continue. The Afghan war is going to continue. It's just the Soviets leave and we leave. Okay. So local warlords, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, they keep fighting that government. Kind of an interesting story you also might want to mention. A few years later, as you get a couple years later into the Bush administration, the CIA realizes something. Some people might have gotten their hands on weapons and money that we didn't want them to get a hold of, i.e. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The U.S. intelligence services, once the Cold War winds down, U.S. intelligence agencies start going, what's the next threat? Fundamentalist Islamic groups or terror groups. If you want to attach that label, you're terrorists, Islamic terrorists. But these groups that are, and so funny story. The CIA actually is going to go back later on and try to buy up those Stinger missiles and other weapons. Like, and so if you're an Afghan warlord, you can get even more money. Funny story. A lot of times, what the CIA would get would be old Soviet Kalashnikov rifles. So it's kind of funny. Anyways, and so the CIA is having a hard time cleaning up their mess. Okay, so that is the H. Bush administration, right? We leave. We actually go back a couple of years later to try to get these weapons back, and we pay even more money. So, that's kind of a funny thing. Okay, and so that's the Bush administration, the H. Bush administration. You have the CIA is left. They go back to look for weapons later. The war continues. Okay, the war keeps going. Okay, just, we're no longer helping. So the Clinton administration, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda by the mid-90s has left to Somalia, Sudan, not Somalia, but the Sudan and other places. The Al-Qaeda will come back in the late 90s, 2000s, the other one period, but during the mid-90s, though, Al-Qaeda actually leaves for a while, for the most part. So you have the Taliban, you have all these other warlords, and what ends up happening is the Taliban win their war. They win that war. So it's kind of like the communist government the communist or Marxist government in Afghanistan is fighting all these little groups. And so it's kind of like who wins. The Taliban end up winning. Okay, by 1995, and that would be the Clinton administration. And what they do is they institute Sharia law, which is a strict Islamic law. Some people attach fundamentalists. It's like how was Islam originally supposed to be practiced, like, in the 8th century? What did Muhammad attend, kind of a thing. And so, on the final, you'll kind of trace that. Afghanistan during the Carter administration, Reagan, H. Bush, and now Clinton. And so that sets you up for what? 9/11, right? By 2000, Al-Qaeda is back in Afghanistan. The Taliban are running the show. 9/11 happens, and that's where you get us involved in Afghanistan, where we invade to topple the Taliban regime, who we argue is helping Al-Qaeda, shelter Al-Qaeda. And so those Iran-Contra, how the Cold War ends peacefully, how the Cold War ends violently in Afghanistan, those are the main topics for the final. So you two classes are actually ready for the final. I'm looking it over. I've gone over the main topics for you to go over. So watch the video. I hope it's helpful. And email me if you need to go over more or you want to talk about it. Have a great day.